Welcome everyone to AE911Truth Webinars. I'm Richard Gage, architect of 29 years and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And you're on our three-part webinar series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, where we look at the destruction of the three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. And we begin today with the third tower, solving the collapse of the World Trade Center Building 7, the first in our three-part series, which we will be naming 9/11, An Architect's Guide. And we focus on the architects because we are putting together a course for architects, specifically in the American Institute of Architects, with a course because, never before has a steel frame high-rise collapsed from fire. So why then did World Trade Center 7 collapse on 9/11? That's what we're looking at today. And of course, the collapse was attributed to normal office fires, yet it occurred in the exact manner of a classic controlled demolition. So today, together, we'll be evaluating which of the two hypotheses, fire-induced failure or controlled demolition, is more consistent with the evidence. So you'll be encouraged today, after you see this webinar, to decide for yourself if a new investigation is warranted. Our objectives for the course today, you're going to be able to describe the characteristics of building fires, the material properties of steel, and the aspects of design that contribute to make fire-induced failure in steel frame high-rises a rare occurrence. We'll be looking at the features associated with fire-induced failure, and you'll be able to recognize those distinct features, and also those of controlled demolition. As well, you'll be able to describe the step-by-step series of structural failures that NIST found to be the cause of the collapse in World Trade Center 7, as well as you will be able to analyze the physical evidence and the dynamics of Building 7's collapse according to how consistent they are with the hypothesis of fire-induced failure and controlled demolition. Well, I've been an architect, as I mentioned, for quite a while, worked on numerous different types of steel frame and other types of projects. This one in the San Francisco Bay Area, $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and more recently in the Las Vegas area, the 6-block long, $400 million mixed-use project with retail, mid-rise office space, altogether over 1,200 tons of steel framing, fireproofed. So that's just a little bit about me. Let's talk about Building 7. Most architects don't know about the World Trade Center Building 7. We go to the shows, the architectural conventions, and we present the building, and most of them indeed don't even know that a third tower fell. Most engineers don't know. And I'd say half the structural engineers don't even know yet. This is the third worst structural and failure in modern history. And so how can it be that we don't know about it in the industry? So we've dedicated ourselves at AE911Truth with over 2,700 architects and engineers to educating the profession. So that's what we're about today. This is a 47-story skyscraper, after all. Each floor was a football field in size. It'd be the tallest building in most of our states. Here it is here, as you can see, right adjacent to the World Trade Center complex itself. It was built in the mid-'80s by Larry Silverstein. And it did indeed suffer a catastrophic collapse. We're going to look at that. It's about a football field away from the North Tower. And when the North Tower went down, there was some minor damage, which NIST says is not a significant factor in the collapse of this building. Well, here it is, surviving the collapse, of course, standing for another 7 hours. Doesn't collapse until 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11. Let's take our first look at the collapse of this tower, and then let's talk about it. Here's Dan Rather from CBS.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible picture work. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, this is very helpful information from Mr. Rather. He's using his intuition, of course, to describe what he's seeing. We've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, and of course, this looks exactly like those. We'll compare them. But the official story claims that fires brought this building down. Normal office fires. Remember, this building wasn't hit by an airplane. So it's an isolated case study from all of the, or most of the drama, the psychological terror that we experienced with regard to the planes hitting the buildings and all those people dying. Because in Building 7, it was evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before they came down. So according to the official story, nobody died in this building. So these are the worst office fires that were started, presumably when the debris from the World Trade Center Twin Towers hit this building, and they're few, small, and scattered, as you can see. And here they are burning on the 12th floor, the site of the initiation of collapse that NIST theorizes. And so, yes, they're burning up till about 3 p.m. And in this area, column 79, which NIST focuses their attention on because there was a failure up above column 79 initially. So here is NIST's analysis of the fires. They down about 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, they show large fires burning in and around the northeast section here around column 79, up past 5 o'clock. And that's important because NIST's theory is that thermal expansion caused this building to collapse. The fires were thermally expanding these beams. We'll look at that. But notice that the photograph themselves, as early as 3:50 p.m., show on the 12th and 13th floor that that fire was burned out completely by 3:50. Over an hour before this building collapsed, that fire is out on those floors, 12th and 13th floor, that NIST focuses their whole theory of collapse on. More likely, according to the photographs that you see in the center column here, the fires were out and moving past that point. So in the first column, we have shown what is more likely a consistent pattern of fire based on the photographs. In other words, 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, no fires around column 79. So this is one of our early problems we noticed with the NIST report. The NIST report focuses on the expansion of these long span steel beams and suggests that they pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79, allowing this floor 13 to fall on 12, 12 on 10, 10 on 9, etc., causing an internal cascading, pancaking collapse. And then the overall building comes down in the manner you just saw, narrated by Dan Rather. Well, we have so many problems with the NIST report that we've noticed, and we want to share those with you. First of all, this building, those fires were out, right? So they couldn't have been expanding these beams while they're not even burning for an hour and a half prior to the collapse of this building in this area. Second of all, these beams are fireproof. They're not going to be expanding at all. They are insulated. In addition, NIST applied in their computer model all of the heat to these beams in just 1.5 seconds, forcing them to expand and breaking the shear studs to the concrete floor slab up above, but also forcing them to expand rather than sag. As you'll see later, beams that are subjected to tests in test fires sag, they don't expand. They sag before they can expand. Also, this girder is proven in the shop drawings, which you see here. This girder has 30 shear studs tying it to the concrete slab up above. So it can't be pushed laterally to the right off of its seat on this column. But let's say that were true, and all that could happen. That these beams could expand, that this girder could force sideways. This floor wouldn't even have failed 13 on above 12, because there's 2 other girders, massive girders, framed into this column. And they would have kept that floor from collapsing at all. But let's say all of that is true and this floor collapsed, and it managed to reach this floor and from an isolated failure cause multiple floors to collapse, as NIST explained. That would have caused massive deformation in the exterior perimeter structure as that internal pancaking collapse was proceeding, because those beams are all tied very, very well to the exterior. We would have seen massive breaking of granite panels, massive breaking of windows, and crumpling of this building like a beer can. That's all we would have seen. And in addition, NIST leaves out additional key structural components like you see here. This is column 79. This is the massive girder that was supposed to have been pushed up the page, if you will, girder, this huge girder. But in order to allow that to happen in their computer model, NIST had to omit these stiffeners. These are steel plates designed to keep the web from crippling, but they also protect they also manage to reinforce the bottom flange of this girder, so that as it's sliding off of its seat, according to NIST's thermal expansion theory, being pushed off of its seat, that flange would have folded, because NIST says, well, it didn't have to be pushed all the way off of its seat, only enough past the web so that it could fold. Well, that would never have folded because of these stiffeners. That turns out to be quite important in the scheme of things. So that couldn't have happened either. So NIST goes on and produces a computer animation. Let's take a look at it. Compared to the actual video on the left, NIST computer animation on the right shows, as you can see, a massive series of failures. 400 structural steel connections have to fail every second in order for this building to collapse like a house of cards. So that can't happen without you just releasing them magically inside the computer program. So several of us said to NIST, well, why won't you release the input data so we can see? The architects and engineers who want to study this building need to see your input data. So this is a transparent, peer-reviewed process. Well, we got the note back. It might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this computer input data. Well, wait a minute. We're the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. We have to know how this building came down. We have to know what you assumed in your input data. Well, you can also see quite clearly in this computer animation that it stops. It begins to fall over. So what do? They stop it after 2 seconds. They won't even show us what happens to this computer model. It doesn't behave anything like the video. In fact, it begins to crumple like a beer can, behaving somewhat naturally. They can't even get their own computer model to mimic what's happening in reality. So we have a whole number of problems with the computer model, which is supposed to prove NIST theory, but it completely disproves it. Well, we use the scientific method, therefore, in our effort to determine what happened at this and the failure of this 47-story skyscraper, unprecedented. We have a question. How did the tower come down? Well, maybe fire brought it down. Maybe controlled demolition brought it down. All the hypotheses are laid out, and none are rejected summarily. None are favored due to our internal bias. We remain objective. That's the purpose of the scientific method. We've had it 100 years or so. So what do? We perform background research. We make observations. We construct that hypothesis and make predictions based on it. Well, if fire brought it down, we'd be looking for this, this, and this. If explosives brought it down, we'd be looking for that, this, that, the other thing. Well, we test those predictions with experiments. We analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our work and carry the science forward. That's how it's worked in this country, when it works. And it's not working here because NIST, for instance, did not report their results. For instance, we mentioned the input data for the computer is a complete black box. They will not release it. And that is a huge problem. So let's apply the scientific method. Start by gathering data, doing background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? Well, fire is certainly one of them. Fire is an organic process. It burns out an area in 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a fire does bring down a building, we expect that it would fall over in stages, not systematically straight down through the intact, cold, hard steel below. But in fact, never before in history, before or after 9/11, have we seen a steel frame skyscraper collapse due to fire. It doesn't happen. But say in wood frame buildings, we'd expect those features typical of a natural process following following asymmetry, not symmetrical. But there have been some great tests done in the United Kingdom, for instance, on a 7-story steel frame building. Let's take a look.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring to the 9/11 catastrophic structural failures. So this is a very important test. It shows exactly what happens in experiment. The arbitrator the arbiter of competing hypotheses when in office fires. So let's look at office fires. In 1988 in Los Angeles, we had this building, the First Interstate building, burning 3.5 hours over 5 floors, no collapse. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors, no collapse. Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors, no collapse. That's important. So we're building a body of evidence here. Set this on the shelf as we move forward and look at other types of collapses, natural collapses, in these cases by earthquakes. These mid-rise buildings have collapsed in a natural process. The structure is not dismembered. The concrete is not pulverized. We see a building, certainly quite damaged, but recognizable as a building. So let's set that on the shelf as we look at what explosions do to buildings. Of course, we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds from the explosives. The massive heat expanding these cauliflower-shaped plumes with a thickly defined edge surrounding them as this heat cloud expands rapidly. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There are suspended solids from the pressure, explosive pressure of the chemical reactions also. Well, of course, explosives can be used quite efficiently in buildings to bring them down, where operatives technicians set thousands of explosives adjacent to the columns and beams called cutter charges. This enables the building to collapse at symmetrically, if that's their desire, or asymmetrically, if they want, and near free fall acceleration, as fast as a bowling ball falling off the side of the tower. This is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can even accomplish, much less fire. Fire's never done this to buildings, particularly concrete, steel buildings, of course. So there are features associated with controlled demolition, usually a sudden onset of destruction, and usually at the base of the structure, but not always. A straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because demolition waves remove those column supports. This results in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of columns supporting the building for its life, resulting in the total dismemberment of the structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment, causing minimal damage to adjacent structures. Number 7, sounds and flashes of explosives heard and seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete in number 8 here, and number 9, explosive charges, sometimes called squibs in the industry, demolition industry. These are isolated explosive charges that are obviously explosives. And of course, chemical evidence and other evidence of cutter charges left behind in the residue. These are 10 key characteristic features of explosive destruction, not fire. Fire can't create, in fact, we believe, any one of these 10, let alone all of them. So if you can show that a building had all 10 key characteristic features, you're pretty sure what happened to that building. Explosive destruction, especially if you have additional corroborative evidence like government documentation. Well, that helps. Experts agreeing, or at least those experts who are unbiased in their opinion. For instance, one would expect that the controlled demolition companies in the United States would be favorably arguing toward in agreement with the source of their $100,000 per annual contracts, which they might prefer to secure rather than jeopardize through an objective opinion about whether the buildings on 9/11 were building 7 on 9/11 was a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge of destruction. Well, if you don't just bring these buildings down in an afternoon, it takes months of planning. You have to secure permits if you want to do it legally. So we know, people know when there's a controlled demolition. Video documentation, all that is additional proof of controlled demolition. So with this in mind, we're going to take a look at Building 7 and see if it has any of these features of controlled demolition. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Well, let's listen to Daryl, a medical student, witness on hand, one of several witnesses we'll be looking at. See what he says.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was well, it looked like there was a shockwave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. And you know, it was horrifying. And then you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out. And the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock.
A sound of a clap of thunder, shockwave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Not the building coming down and then it causing these sounds. This is an order that you'll hear again and again with regard to these witnesses. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's take a look from West Street at this building's catastrophic collapse. Pretty symmetrical, pretty straight down. Look at the penthouse. The center screen wall and penthouse drops uniformly across its width, indicating that all 24 core columns have been removed. Now, this completely pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST story, theory, which says that there was this isolated incident which caused the global vertical collapse on the east side, and then this collapse traveling across the building in about 10 seconds or so. And then the overall building coming down in about 7 seconds, as you see here. So that can't happen, according to what you're seeing here with your own eyes in the center penthouse, which indicates a complete failure of all 24 columns at once in the core. So it does indeed fall into its own footprint. The center of the pile is centered in the property. 4 to 6 stories tall. We had a 47-story skyscraper here, completely collapsed. Let's compare it to a controlled demolition on the right, building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since no fire has ever brought down a high-rise? Wouldn't we expect that NIST would have focused their attention on controlled demolition exclusively, if not, initially? But it was brushed aside and written off. And yet there's all this evidence, like the complete removal of columns. Number 3, demolition waves. In order just to produce the symmetry of the overall collapse, much less the collapse of the penthouse we just saw, you'd have to remove all 24 core columns, and then followed by the perimeter columns, systematically synchronized, floor by floor. Otherwise, this building is going to tip. The symmetry is the smoking gun here, along with all the other smoking guns. How fast did the building come down? Number 4, let's look at free fall acceleration. Here's David Chandler, physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance. Freefall proves Building 7 was a demolition, not a natural collapse.
That's pretty clear. It's as if 8 stories from this building were automatically, magically removed in a fraction of a second, allowing the upper part of the building to fall as fast as a bowling ball. NIST actually acknowledges this. After they were denying it early on for 7 years, they, in their final report, after being publicly embarrassed by David Chandler, whom you just heard, in their conference call, their online conference. It wasn't online, it was an actual conference call, but they took calls and they were embarrassed into finally admitting that it did fall at free fall, but they did not acknowledge the implications of a freely falling structure against 40,000 tons of intact, cold, hard structural steel that that all except for their initiation of theory, initiation of collapse theory, was not even hot. So how about the total dismemberment of the steel structure? Again, we have the complete dismemberment of the columns from the beams, allowing this building to fall like a house of cards. Structures that fall due to natural causes don't completely dismember like that. Well, what about the other structures surrounding? Minimal damage, pretty minimal. This is a very controlled process. In other words, do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Let's listen to Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who was on hand to help that day, right close to Building 7.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And Bill Rosati.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with the attorney for Mayor Giuliani, Michael Hess, had gone back into the building after it was evacuated, but before, obviously, it came down. In fact, before the towers came down that morning, they were in this building experiencing this.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions. What's in the sound? Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
When we get outside, the police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs also. Explosions like this one heard the afternoon of 9/11.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Yeah, you want to call your mother or something?
In the area of Building 7. How many of these witnesses of explosions ended up mentioned in the official report, the 1,000-page report on the destruction of Building 7? Absolutely none. Do we have enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete? Feature number 8. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide for 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, NFPA 921, suggests, and NIST actually helped write this, so they should be very aware of it, of the the guidelines within it. Look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, these plumes were indeed observed directly after the final destruction, as you can see, racing away in every direction from the destruction of Building 7 here, rapidly expanding 35 miles an hour, expanding out away from Building 7. Much more heat in these cauliflower plumes than were in those few small scattered fires. You say, where did that heat come from? So we're looking for all other evidence of all this heat, for instance, produced by the NASA infrared sensitive cameras from the overflights here, showing temperatures on the surface of World Trade Center 7 after its collapse of 1,340 degrees. Now that's hotter than most office fires, yet there's no fire on the surface. Where's the source of these massive temperatures? Well, it's way down in the pile. So it must be much, much, much hotter down there as it releases, as that heat is measured on the surface. It's be much more reduced. So, in fact, the author of the FEMA report that came out in 2002, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, where did those high temperatures come from? How does fire, normal office fires, evaporate steel, as documented here by structural engineer Abelhazan Astani Azel, who had the National Science Foundation grant to study the steel that was taken to the landfill. Well, this gentleman, John Gross himself, documented this partly evaporated ends of the steel beams. In fact, he cut off the very piece that was used in the metallurgical examination for FEMA in their Appendix C. So he should be very aware of it. And yet you'll find in this series that he denies it. Well, the fires, according to Thomas Iger, one of the supporters of the official stories, suggests they were 1,200 degrees. NIST claims without evidence that the fires were up to 1,800 degrees. The structural steel melts at 2,700 degrees. So what can account for that? Well, we'll be looking at thermite, an incendiary that produces extremely high temperatures. See, hydrocarbons can only burn in open air. I mean, even jet fuel, 600 to 1,400 degrees maximum. So it can't be responsible for these temperatures that are documented here. And yet, steel or iron, as we'll find out, had definitely melted during the event. And here you have photographic evidence of liquid, hot, molten metal pouring out of the material held in the jaws of this excavator. By the color temperature, we know it's well over 2,000 degrees. Okay, so what caused the steel or iron to melt? And do we have chemical evidence of some sort of cutter charge? Well, FEMA itself documents in their Appendix C in the May of 2002 report that they initially did with a $600,000 budget before NIST took over the investigation in 2002 and finally produced their report in 2008, 7 years after 9/11. What does FEMA find? Never before observed phenomena, eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this piece here. Fires don't do that. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Where did the sulfur come from? They have no idea. NIST later speculates, oh, that must have been calcium sulfate from the gypsum board. But calcium sulfate doesn't turn into sulfur. It's bonded, and gypsum board has never attacked the steel that it is designed for 100 years to protect. Nope, can't be that. Liquid iron. So now we know, documented by FEMA, that this is not melted steel, but liquid iron, molten iron. How did iron get there, and how did it get molten? Two separate questions. Where did the sulfur come from that attacked the steel, causing the evaporation of the ends of the steel beams? Well, they document it very carefully. The New York Times calls this the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, this eutectic reaction. Well, could thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, could it have caused this phenomena? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere. If thermite was used, it could explain the extreme hot temperatures, because it produces 4,000 degree temperatures. It could explain the presence of iron, molten iron, because iron is an ingredient of thermite, iron oxide and aluminum, elemental iron, not steel. And it could also explain the presence of the sulfur, which is added to thermite, which gives accelerated results in these cutter charges. Well, maybe we're getting somewhere. In fact, the NFPA Guide 921 says you look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials when you have these extreme hot temperatures. Now, NIST acknowledges that it didn't look for such evidence after claiming that they did not find evidence of explosives or residues of explosives. They actually acknowledge in writing that they never looked for it. And they still refuse to do so. But others have. In fact, others like Stephen Jones, and who's looked at the steel and finds, gosh, this doesn't look like an oxy-acetylene torch cut that the iron workers used at the site. In fact, that looks like this. This is a clean oxy-acetylene torch cut. This is something else, leaving residue of aluminum. Well, he does an analysis on this material, this one from the International Peace Park in Manitoba, and where we have additional aluminum residue. in an unclean burn, the aluminum oxide doesn't, the reaction doesn't produce cleanly all the time. So what does he find? Evidence of molten iron, manganese, silica, oxygen, aluminum, all of the ingredients of thermite, thermite reactions, let's say. Well, what else was found in this powder that was ubiquitous across Lower Manhattan, a 3 square mile area, river to river, 4 inches thick? Officials and independent environmental consulting firms like R.J. Lee find these iron microspheres. So they're elemental iron. They're the size of the diameter of a human hair on average. They're in all the World Trade Center samples. They're indicating melting of iron, exposure to extreme heat, further than what can be produced in the office fires. And they're round. Fascinating. Where did they come from? They don't know. They don't know, but it's a signature component. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these atypical, typical in the dust, characteristic of the dust, but atypical in office fires, atypical everywhere else. So it's a key signature component. It's defined by the EPA. Well, they're found in all of these studies by the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee. Here's what happens when you ignite thermite. Slowing it down, you can see thousands of molten iron droplets. They are spherical. Why? Because when a liquid is aerosolized, its surface tension forms itself into a sphere, especially under explosive or pressure conditions, even as low pressure as this. You have thousands of spheres. Well, that can explain the spheres. It can explain the extreme temperatures. It can explain the elemental iron. But can it be used to cut through steel? So in his backyard, civil engineer John Cole makes his own thermite cutter charges and cuts cleanly through steel. You can see this in the Great Thermite Debate video online. In fact, there are patented cutter charges, devices that are used to issue thick streams of molten iron in just hundreds of milliseconds through structural steel, cutting much more efficiently than, in fact, high energy explosives like C4 or RDX. RDX being more commonly used for controlled demolitions, but that provides a very loud bang, very bright flashes, which in a deceptive controlled demolition would leave evidence this of an incredible audio and visual signature. So what else was found in this dust? Well, a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit and Stephen Jones they collected independently collected and analyzed samples of 4 ultimately, and all of these samples contain the same red-gray chips. Very curious. They look like paint, of course, at first, primer paint of some kind, but they come up to a magnet, and so they have an extreme high iron content, and they get real curious, and they look carefully at the red layer, and they find ingredients of iron, aluminum, silica, oxygen, carbon, ingredients of thermite found in the World Trade Center dust. What is that doing in all the samples of the World Trade Center dust? Well, they get even more curious, look into the red layer with an electron microscope. What do they find? Extremely small particles of iron oxide and aluminum platelets on the aluminum. And these are smaller than 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of human hair. They're in a proportion to become thermite, 3/4 iron oxide to 1/4 aluminum. They're set in a bed of an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. So this is, of course, extremely fascinating. This is not normal thermite. This is extremely sophisticated material that is an energetic material like thermite. At 420 degrees centigrade, it ignites, producing much more energy than it had. All 4 samples, in concert with published data, which did the same thing from what's known as super thermite, an incendiary that at the Los Alamos lab and Lawrence Livermore laboratories, they engineer incendiaries to become more explosive. That's what the organic content does in explosives and in this material. In fact, when they do, and this was done with a differential scanning calorimeter from the material they found, the chips that they found in the World Trade Center dust, they produced the same spheres with the same chemical signature as the spheres that were found in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where the World Trade Center dust spherical spheres came from. They came from these chips, as if we didn't know, because these spheres are found in the dust samples attached to these partially ignited chips. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of evidence that has to be explained, but wasn't even addressed by NIST. It seemed to have been carefully avoided because there were experts brought over, like Foreman Williams from SAIC, who is an expert in nanothermite, brought into the NIST report to help guide it. Well, this is called super thermite. It has been developed well before 9/11. You see, when you have extremely small particles like this, the surface volume increases exponentially, and you have chemical reactions that occur virtually instantly, engineering an incendiary, which destroys by means of heat into more explosive properties. So this is a very sophisticated material made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So it is obviously a source of investigation that needs to be included, but was not. It's documented in the 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. This was not challenged in the peer-reviewed sense. That's how you challenge somebody's idea or theory, or you put forth a peer-reviewed paper of your own, providing other technical scientific evidence. You don't just say, hey, those are paint chips. No, paint chips don't have these exotic properties. And the destruction of this building, however, does have the properties or features of controlled demolition, all 10 of them. And fire can't account for any one of them, we believe, much less all of them. Why? Well, these buildings are fireproofed. 2- and 3-hour fire protection does an amazing job historically of never allowing any high-rise to collapse that's fireproofed. They're all fireproofed, of course. Yet, if there was any of the World Trade Center buildings that were going to collapse due to fire, we might expect it to be this one, World Trade Center 5, which obviously is completely engulfed in fire. Did it collapse? No. Mid-rise, high-rise office buildings don't collapse due to fire. Not even in China, where we have this 44-story tall building in 2009, the Mandarin Hotel, burning from bottom to top with a major conflagration. Did it come down? No, before on the left, after on the right, slightly toasted around the edges, being remodeled, put back into use. Yet these few small scattered fires in this massive 47-story skyscraper drops in just 6.5 seconds. No, architects and engineers across the country are not buying it. This unprecedented collapse needs to be looked at yet again. And that's why we're inviting you to support us in calling for a new investigation. Support us if you're an AIA member, particularly with co-sponsoring our resolution calling for the AIA, American Institute of Architects, to call for a new investigation. Especially considering this additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, like the data from the FEMA and NIST reports, where there were original investigations, and starting with volunteers from the American Society of Civil Engineers, but these volunteers all were heavily dependent on federal contracts. That led into the FEMA report with the same volunteers finally receiving some funding, not much, given that it was the one of the most catastrophic structural failures in history after the Twin Towers. Finally, in 2008, 7 years after 9/11, the final report was issued by NIST, 1,000 pages, which did not include any of the evidence that you've heard today. And the American Institute of Architects simply rubber-stamped this report without submitting it to any kind of peer-reviewed process among their membership. Try it. Search for World Trade Center Building 7 on the website of the American Institute of Architects and see if you can find anything other than a simple letter, which I'm trying to get my hands on, actually. Also, it's very difficult to find anything. So that's my challenge to you. All of these reports contained most of the same individuals. In other words, they are not independent reports. And there was no report from the American Institute of Architects. Well, FEMA did do, in their initial report, they suggested, hey, it looked like an internal failure, an implosion. Well, that's a start. And they say the specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Wait a minute. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? Wait, your best hypothesis, fire and random damage, has a low probability of occurrence. You go back and you find a hypothesis that has a better probability of occurrence, such as controlled demolition. Well, they say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, what we experienced here in 2 weeks after 9/11 was the most massive illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene that's ever been performed. 99% of the steel from the World Trade Center was sent to China for recycling before it could be investigated by engineers. 400 truckloads a day. Forcing Bill Manning, the editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to say crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it wasn't. Well, what do the experts say? Those experts, again, who might be less biased in their opinions. So here's Danny Jowenko, 27-year controlled demolition expert from Europe. Starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. Now, he's being shown on a laptop the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, but they didn't tell him where this building was or when it happened. They're just showing him a destruction of a building, and he's been asked to give an opinion, cold. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without any doubt. And then they say, well, did you know this happened on 9/11? And he says, what? He's confused, obviously. Are you really? And they say, yeah, look, right here. This is the third tower that came down on 9/11 in the afternoon. He says, well, they must have worked very fast. In other words, he still has no doubt that it's a controlled demolition, but he can't figure out how that might have happened by operatives who must have gone into the building while it's on fire, because those fires started about noon or 1 o'clock. So it was burning for like 4 hours. Anyway, he can't figure it out, but he held up until the time of his untimely death a couple of years ago. He held to that opinion, as did Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus of Chairman of Department of Structural Dynamics at Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished, as has 100 structural engineers who have signed on to the petition at AE911Truth calling for a new investigation. Among the 2,700 architects and engineers overall. A localized failure in a steel frame building, says Kamal Obaid, like World Trade Center 7, cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Well, there's a carefully crafted statement designed to be as objective as possible. Is there any evidence, though, of foreknowledge? We mentioned that if there's a controlled demolition, there's people that obviously set it up, planned it, engineered it. Well, let's just take a look. What do the fire chiefs know? We're moving a command post over this way. That building's coming down. Well, I don't know exactly what time this is, but it's well before the building came down in an unprecedented fashion. So they know the building's coming down. In fact, the EMT worker, Indira Singh, was told that we have to move the triage site, which was at Building 7, because the Building 7 was going to come down or was being brought down. The interviewer says, did they actually use the words brought down? And who was it that was telling you this? The fire department. They did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down. Well, obviously fire departments don't bring buildings down. So they're referring to somebody else having to bring it down, as are these construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, and then looking straight into the CNN camera, saying this.
All right, guys. We are looking back. It's a building about to blow up. Hopefully, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know the building is about to come down, much less is about to be blown up? And what does Kevin McPadden say before the statement about the explosions that we heard earlier today? He and others were held many blocks away from Building 7, and they're listening. In his case, Kevin McPadden's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And here's this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? something else is happening here. In fact, the BBC reported the collapse, the unprecedented collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happened, at 5 o'clock. Well, they apologized for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does this make them psychic? What's really going on here? Something we're not being told. Well, that's speculation, perhaps. Maybe there's an explanation for that. But the evidence shows that the hypothesis of controlled demolition is much more likely corroborated. And that's why we have 2,700 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation, and why we're inviting you to join us if you believe we have 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition, none of which can be explained by fire, with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence. We believe this is proof of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt, and that a new investigation is warranted. And that's why we are gathering our forces together, educating the profession, and have put together an extensive website of evidence which you can look further into, and materials and resources that you can look further into, such as our 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, which looks at the destruction of the Twin Towers as well, of which there are many questions. We have, in fact, with our supporters, 2,000 supporters calling for a new investigation, supporting AE911Truth, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, in securing our own $300,000 study performed by Professor Leroy Hulsey at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, a 2-year study doing the computer analysis, which NIST did not do with objectivity and transparency. So that's very exciting. We invite you to become a part of that. Go to WTC7evaluation.org. Support us there. And I am joined by Andy Steele, our operations coordinator, who has been helpful all along through the webinar series and has been with us all day gathering questions. And I'm very excited to introduce to you Andy Steele. Andy.
Hey, Richard. Yeah, we got 3 questions today. And the first one asks, what new information could architects and engineers expect to find if the government released the computer data on Building 7?
Well, fascinating question. Andy, be sure to pop those up too so that I can see them in writing on my screen. NIST released the computer input data, for instance, for Building 7. We would know how, for instance, those joints were released. The connections, the column to beam connections throughout this building, as we saw in their computer model, all released at once, almost from top to bottom. And still they couldn't get the building to come down at the computer model in the building in the computer model to come down at free fall acceleration. So we would find out, well, what were the parameters? How is it even remotely possible that all those connections could have been released so fast? What did you do to the steel properties, the bolts, the welds, that could be only explained, according to the official story, by fire? But you won't let us know that. That's one example. Andy, can you think of others as well?
Well, I think the key important factor in terms of releasing the computer data, the computer model data of Building 7, is that if you believe NIST's explanation of what really happened that day, despite all the overwhelming evidence that controlled demolition is what took the building down, then we have a serious fire safety hazard for firefighters who could be battling very fightable fires that were in World Trade Center 7 on that day. That means that a few thermally expanding beams can bring a building crashing down in 7 seconds, just like a controlled demolition. So not releasing this information actually puts the public in greater safety danger, greater danger, because architects and engineers can't analyze it to figure out how to keep something like this from happening again. So if they're not going to look at the evidence of controlled demolition and they want to tell you that this phenomenon happened on 9/11 and only 9/11, then we got to deal with the ramifications of that. So, just sum it up, the public is in is in more danger as a result of them not disclosing that. So it needs to be open and transparent for everyone to see, including the professional community.
Excellent. And there are hundreds of high rises that may be subject to similar forces. There's dozens and dozens of high rises that are somewhat similarly designed to Building 7 with long span beams that are subject to thermal expansion. Yes, we've got to know a whole lot more. And yet, you know what, as Andy indicated, there's been no modifications to the structural steel, the structural design of the International Building Code. There's been improvements in egress from fires, the codes. There's been improvements to fireproofing, i.e. adhesion of the fireproofing to the steel. But there's been no improvements adopted by the International Building Code to make these high rises safer structurally to the effects of fire temperatures.
Okay, our next question asks us, does there exist any steel from the World Trade Center that could still be analyzed if the government did a new investigation?
Yes, there's plenty of steel. They only destroyed 99% of it. That sounds like a lot. And of course, it was all illegally shipped to China for recycling, starting 2 weeks after 9/11 before investigators could get to it. But there remains about 256 pieces of steel, and they're in sculptures around the country. And those that have been analyzed have been found to have the residue of thermite. And so I didn't show you all of that in today's limited 1-hour program, but indeed we have we have a lot more analyzed by Professor Stephen Jones, and for instance, and it is damning evidence. The steel shows what happened. More importantly, the videos themselves are our most clearly, undeniable, irrefutable proof of controlled demolition, because it looks exactly like that, but also the extreme temperatures for which there's abundant evidence, not just in the steel, but photographic, documented evidence by Bechtel showing 2,500 degree temperatures Fahrenheit. It's amazing how much evidence there is. So it's not like we need more evidence or need to recover the steel or even the dust from the World Trade Center, of which there's hundreds of thousands of tons of buried in the landfill called fresh kills under 6 feet of concrete. It's all there still, but we don't. There's just so much evidence, so we don't need to worry about the portions that are missing.
Okay, our last question today asks, did the construction workers in the video you showed tell CNN or anyone who told them that the building was about to be blown up?
Well, we don't know what those construction workers said to anybody other than what was filmed, and we don't know who they might have told afterward. What they did say is the building is about to be blown up, flame and debris coming down. Keep your eye on that building. After an initial explosion, just that amount of foreknowledge is enough to cause all of us to call for a new investigation. Remember, what happened after 9/11? We had a massive invasion of two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, in which 7,000 U.S. soldiers were killed, 2 million Iraqis and Afghanis. The complexion and nature of the Middle East has been altered, destroyed in many cases forever. Well, not forever, but massively. And we've, through legislation here at home and executive orders like the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, legislation like the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, we have lost many of our civil liberties, which our forefathers fought for. For instance, any of us can be arrested, Americans, without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. We can be held indefinitely. We can be even be assassinated, tortured. This is all legal, using my fingers as quotation marks. We're engaged in a $4.5 trillion global war on terror. If there's any question about the cause of all of that, which was on 9/11, which the smoking gun of which is here in Building 7, which we've been studying today, then we've got to have a new investigation. That's why we're going back 15 years now and saying, whoa, wait a minute. Now, those in the 9/11 research community have been after this for 15 years. This isn't, you may be hearing about it now, but we've been screaming about it for 10 years at AE911Truth and others for 15 years. So it's never too late to say, whoa, there is no statute of limitations on mass murder or even treason, which this evidence may lead us to. We don't know. We don't speculate on who was involved in this, but obviously if somebody placed charges in these buildings, we need a real investigation to find out who and find out what their motives were. We're scientific. We're looking at the scientific evidence, the forensic evidence in the destruction of this building. We lay it out. It's up to criminal investigators to follow the evidence wherever it leads and prosecute individuals for crimes that, you know, we're not legal experts here. We're technical and building professionals giving you the evidence. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Back to you, Andy.
Well, that's going to conclude the questions for today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching this presentation. And again, if you know anybody in the building trades industry, please forward it to them. Simply ask them what they think. Don't tell them what you think. Ask them what they think after watching this presentation. And that's always a good strategy for opening minds. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we're going to do it again next week at the same time, next Thursday. And we'll see you then.
Yes, thanks so much. And thanks, Andy. Really appreciate all your help today. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific. Over and out.